Welcome to Hearthside Lore. When the forces of the vampire lords march to war, the world trembles. The undead are among the most dangerous creatures in the known world. Bound by the will of one of the lords of undeath, they are a fell and mighty foe. They cannot be reasoned with, bribed or coerced. They know neither fear nor mercy. They need no sleep or warmth, neither drink nor wholesome sustenance. And, as they march onwards, their ranks are swelled by the corpses and trapped souls of their former opponents. The only thing they fear are the rays of the sun that are the bane of their type, searing their unholy flesh, and eventually destroying these abominations against nature. This is no help when the armies of the vampire counts march to war, since the lords of the undead can use their necromantic powers to summon billowing storm clouds, protecting themselves and their minions from the hated sun. Where the dead walk, there the night follows. The legions of the living dead are terrible to behold. Hordes of corpses walking resolutely forward, dry flesh creaking, decaying inwards exposed, corroded war gear scraping and clanking. The nauseating stench of death hangs over the army like a cloud of contagion. The air is full of grave dust and glowing witchlights. Long dead warriors ride to battle mounted on the rotting carcasses of war horses. The earth trembles beneath the tread of zombies, and the howl of the dire wolves fills mortals with dread. Spirits prowl like shadows among the ranks, insubstantial wraiths, wailing banshees, and wights plucked from their cold tombs. At the core of the army stands the vampire general, the most powerful and dangerous of all these nightmare creatures. It is he who has summoned the army from the graves, and it is his will that binds it together. Lahmia, City of Vampires. It all began at the dawn of human civilization, about 4,500 years before present time. South of the Old World, in the land between Araby and the Badlands, was the rich kingdom of Nechrarchs. Priest kings ruled this realm from their capital city of Khemri, and upon their death, they were mummified and entombed in great pyramids. One of the most important priests, who the ancient texts name as Nagash, is said to have learned the secrets of dark magic from a captive dark elf sorceress. He then started to study this vilest of magic for a way to achieve his great desire, immortality. Nagash had a powerful intellect and implacable willpower, and after long years of research and experimentation, he created a new form of sorcery, which he named necromancy. Eventually, he could reanimate dead bodies and prolong his own life indefinitely. This knowledge gave him the key to ultimate power, and he soon became the kingdom's sole ruler. Unfortunately, though he discovered a way to force the spirit not to abandon the body, still, he could find no way of stopping the flesh from succumbing to the vagaries of time. At first, Nagash tried to preserve his body with the secret oils and balms that the priests used to mummify the most important among them. After 2 centuries, however, he could not hide the decay of his body, and eventually he was driven insane by what was happening to him. Soon, Nagash's rule became intolerable, and the priest kings of neighboring cities rebelled against him. After a bitter war, Nagash was defeated and fled towards the World's Edge Mountains with a few acolytes. Many are the dread stories told about the great necromancer, the ritual of summoning, and his wars of vengeance against the kingdom of Nechrarchs and the rest of mankind. But they are to be told elsewhere. Nagash recorded all of his knowledge in 9 huge tomes of parchment made from human skin and written in blood. These books were not destroyed as some of the priests wished. Some of them were lost, and one was secretly taken to the city of Lahmia, the second most powerful city in Nechrarchs. There, the ruling queen was seduced by the promise of immortality, which she found in this evil grimoire, and once again, the search for eternal life began. Soon the queen learned the dark spells to animate and command the dead, and she too became a powerful necromancer. Eventually, she succeeded where Nagash before had failed, and she found something that could stop her immortal body from aging, the elixir of life. It is said that she received the secret of the elixir after striking a pact with a dark force whose name is better left unspoken. After drinking this magical potion, the queen's heart stopped beating forever. But as long as she could feed regularly on the warm blood of the living, her mortal shell would still look deceptively young. The first vampire had been created. The queen then chose 11 individuals who she considered worthy and gave them a sip of the elixir of life. They were the first of their kind and were to be known as master vampires. Once again, unliving priest kings and queens ruled over Nechrarchs. Soon, they found that they could make living men and women into lesser vampires by making them drink part of their own tainted blood, the so-called blood kiss. These new vampires could themselves confer the blood kiss onto other willing, and sometimes unwilling mortals, and in this way, the number of undead increased. But with each new generation, the powers of the vampires were reduced. The masters were creatures of astonishing speed and strength, extremely resilient, and gifted with great necromantic skills. But the ones they created were far less powerful. The vampires reigned over Lahmia for centuries, and they surrounded themselves with an immortal aristocracy who preyed on the unlucky citizens of Lahmia. Eventually, as it had happened with Nagash, the priest kings of Nechrarchs united to fight this evil tyranny. After a long and bitter war, the Lahmian dynasty was defeated, and the city of Lahmia was razed to the ground. Of the original vampires, 7 masters survived the sacking of Lahmia. They fled north, and when they reached the old world, they separated. One went east, perhaps to the distant lands of Cathay. One disappeared in the northern Chaos Wastes, and 4 remained in different parts of the old world. The tragic story of the 7th vampire, Ushoran, of Strigoi, is recorded elsewhere in this book. Each of these masters was gifted with different powers, and these distinctive traits are reflected in all other vampires of their bloodline. Of these lines, the one that to this day remains closest to the vampire's ancient origins is the one descending from Nechrarchs, High Priestess and Queen of Lahmia. Nechrarchs, together with her sisters in the cult of blood, was already far to the north and safe from the purging wrath of the kings of Nechrarchs when their attack struck the city of Lahmia. Nothing was heard of them for many centuries, until at a place called the Silver Pinnacle by the dwarves, a strange event took place. The dwarves had been mining in this remotest part of the world's edge mountains for silver and precious gems, and had built a stronghold there. One night, an invading horde somehow broke into the mountain, taking the defenders by surprise. These were not goblins or skaven, but zombies and skeletons. The event is still recorded in the Book of Grudges. The entry describes their leader as the Queen of Evil. Many centuries have passed since that time. The dwarves have long gone from the area, and now only travelers from the lands of men tread within sight of the place. Strange as it may seem, there are some who have visited the Silver Pinnacle and returned alive to tell the tale. Their tales do not speak of horror as one might think. Instead, they tell of a splendid court, arrayed in the fashions of some ancient civilization, and of a palace cut out of the rock with statues and walls adorned with strange inscriptions. Yet it is a place of darkness, where the light of day is not permitted to enter. The queen who rules here is said to be of exquisite beauty, attended by handmaidens any man would die for. Little do they know that this is literally true. Stories of the palace of the Night Queen have been told for centuries and can be found in the ballads of Bretonnia, the writings of the Empire, and the poems of Teleia. Even in the Kashba of Araby and in the sweat lodges of Kislev can similar rumors be heard. The guards of the Silver Pinnacle are said to be swathed in black and show not their faces. They shuffle and handle their weapons jerkily. The interior of the place is described as dark, lit as if by moonlight. The queen of the mountain is never seen or spoken to directly. She conducts business from behind 7 veils, and her voice is beguiling. It is related that she breeds cats. There is a tale of a Telean merchant who was given a black cat. Halfway to Teleia, the cat was gone, but sitting in his wagon was a beautiful lady. He had no idea where she had appeared from, but took her on to Teleia, asking no questions. There she paid him for the journey, bade him farewell, and entered the monastery of a female religious order. There is another tale, told in Bretonnia, of a knight-errant who returned with a lady of exquisite beauty and a pale complexion. Praised by Bretonnian troubadours, he made her his wife and lady of his castle. Guests at the castle commented that the lady only showed herself at banquets in the night, and that she drank goblets of red wine and ate no other food. These and many other similar tales reveal, to those wise enough to see, how the bloodline of Nechrarchs has spread over many centuries into many lands. In truth, all the vampires of the Lahmian sisterhood descend from the Queen of Lahmia. She is said to despise men and consequently very few Lahmians are males. Instead, enchantingly beautiful maidens are chosen from amongst the most noble families of Bretonnia and the Empire, and granted the blood kiss. They then strive to gain control of the humans around them, with cunning and intrigue. No other vampires excel in infiltrating human society in the same way as this shadowy sisterhood. The presence of the Lahmians is seldom noticed, but their hand is certainly felt. They may lack the brute strength of many other vampires, but in subtlety and cunning, they are unmatched. They can achieve their aims with politics and plotting instead of direct action. They are hedonistic, self-indulgent creatures who love splendor and wealth and will stop at nothing to get what they desire. Yet they cannot taste food or enjoy the warmth of the sun. Their cold hearts can feel no love, and though their youth and beauty is eternal, they are abhorred by people once they are discovered. All this means that no matter how much wealth they gather, or how many pleasures they taste, their joys are always hollow. Lahmian vampires are as fast as quicksilver, and their vampiric powers allow them to melt into the shadows and vanish from the eyes of mortals. They can move so quickly that they are virtually invisible to the eye. The talons of the Lahmians reach to all levels of human society. They take an active interest in human affairs, and no one can guess how many powerful, eccentric noblewomen, widows of princes and dukes, and high-born ladies who shun the light of day and lock themselves in tall towers and opulent palaces, are in truth of the dead. They have a great talent for art and statesmanship, and their powerful personalities hold an irresistible charm for mortals. However, their temper matches the quickness of their bodies, and they are easy to anger, but hard to appease. In the most remote corners of the old world, whole towns have fallen under the dominion of the Lahmians. There, zombies guard the gates, so none can escape, and vampires form the female aristocracy that feeds on mortal cattle each night. Such places must be purged with sword and fire, often only after a bitter battle against the vampires and their servants. The Lahmians, unlike other vampires of the old world, keep in contact with each other and with their mysterious queen Neferata. What the Lahmians' true motives and final purposes are, none can fathom. Sarnovich was in his tent, examining the region's maps while sipping some of the best vodka in all of Kislev. He was thinking how much he hated having been assigned to such a remote outpost in the gloomy woods, which marked the borders between Mother Kislev and the dwarf kingdoms of the World's Edge Mountains. But it was his duty as an ataman of the horse archers to maintain the vigil on the trails coming from the mountain passes. Presently he heard movement outside the tent, and 2 of his men walked in. With them was a girl, one of the most beautiful young ladies he had ever seen. She was very young and frail, her skin pale and her robe in tatters. An expression of sheer terror was on her fair visage, and she was shaking all over. "Ataman, we found this girl on the north path of the Red Glacier. It looks like she's been attacked, but she hasn't said a word.
She's too terrified. We don't even know if she speaks our language." "I see. Now bring her some hot food and something to wear." "Yes, sir." The two men left, but soon returned with what the ataman asked for. Sarnovich observed the girl, and could not avoid being moved by the innocent look she possessed. His heart was filled with a strong affection towards her, for she reminded him of his young daughter. He noticed that she was not eating at all, and drank very little and without enthusiasm. Clearly she was still very scared. The old soldier tried to calm her, speaking softly. "Do not be afraid. We are friends. Friends. Do you understand me?" The girl looked up at him, and seeming to make sense out of his words, she nodded. "What is your name?" asked Sarnovich. "Mara. Me Mara," answered the pretty voice of the girl. The ataman was relieved. He couldn't recognize her accent, but at least some communication was possible. "What happened to you? Where is your family? Mother? Father?" With her innocent eyes open wide, she answered, "Mountain. Monster. Die. All die. Mara no die." And she started to cry, sobbing violently. Sarnovich hugged her softly and lulled her until she stopped crying. Then she seemed to fall asleep exhausted. The ataman decided to leave her alone to rest. He walked out into the red light of the setting sun and called the sergeant. "Yuri, have the men raise a tent for the girl, and double the guard tonight. She has spoken of a monster, and I'm afraid that the group she was traveling with might have been attacked by one of the evil creatures of these mountains. It seems she's the only survivor." "At once, sir." Then the night came. Sarnovich was woken up abruptly by a terrible scream that pierced the darkness. In a moment, he was outside his tent, his sword ready. Where were the guards, he thought, and why had they allowed the campfires to die out? He heard more shouting from the tent where his men slept, and rushed in that direction. He entered the tent cautiously, and by the dim light of the braziers he saw that it was too late. His men were dead. Everything was drenched in blood. Some warriors were still in their beds, their throats ripped open. Others lay on the floor, their bodies torn apart and dismembered, apparently by the talons of a creature of awesome strength. A troll, thought Sarnovich. No, impossible. One of those things couldn't possibly make its way into the camp to surprise these experienced warriors in their beds. What was it then? How could he fight it? The ataman's mind was overwhelmed with fear and anger. Then, a thought hit him like a war hammer. The girl. He had to protect the girl. He rushed towards her tent but found it empty. Where could she possibly be? Suddenly, a new series of cries arose at the edge of the nearby wood. Some of the sentinels were still fighting, and one of the voices was clearly female. She was there. Sarnovich reached the tree line where he could clearly see a torch burning not far ahead. He headed for the light, and almost trampled on the lifeless body of a guard. The girl was leaning against a tree, an arrow protruding from her shoulder. Her clothes were covered in blood, but she was still alive. That was the important thing. She looked at Sarnovich with hope and relief as he approached her cautiously, but then her eyes focused on something over his shoulder and she shouted, "Behind you!" The Kislevites turned, ready to fight, prepared to give his life to protect that innocent girl from the terrible creature which had slaughtered his men. His eyes were scanning the darkness for any trace of the monster, when another voice whispered from just behind his ear, sending a shudder down his spine. It was the languid, sensual voice of a mature woman, with an evil, ironic hint in its tone. "I told you, it was behind you." The feral snarl that followed these words was the last sound that Ataman Sarnovich of Kislev was ever to hear. The Von Carsteins. There are few facts, but much legend surrounding the origins of this vampire bloodline, destined to become the most powerful and important in the history of the old world. It is known, though, that their zenith came when Vlad von Carstein took over the rulership of Sylvania. Before the advent of Vlad, and in fact since the beginning of historical record, Sylvania had always been referred to as a cursed and evil land. Its surface was covered for the most part by dark and dangerous forests, its soil poor and unproductive. It is a land where the darkest energies of magic flow strong. The dead long had the reputation of not resting easily there, as attested by the Sylvanian tradition of burying the dead deeply and face down, so that it was more difficult for them to dig their way to the surface. Rumors circulated in the empire accusing the nefarious von Drac counts and many of the other Sylvanian nobles of being corrupt practitioners of the black arts. Indeed, those rumors were founded in reality. These vile noblemen built their castles at mystical points, where the winds of dark magic concentrated to gather power for their iniquitous spells, and celebrated ancient rituals of death in their dank dungeons. The Sylvanian people were kept in a state of misery and superstitious ignorance, and their squalid hamlets were dominated with ruthless cruelty. Sylvania was a haven for necromancers expelled from the human kingdoms of the old world. The empire tolerated the presence of this accursed place only because the Sylvanians were, at least in theory, loyal to the emperor. But this was to change. In the year 1797, Count Otto von Drac died without a male heir, but a mysterious stranger married his daughter, Isabella, and seized power over Sylvania. The name of the newcomer was Vlad von Carstein. The nobles of Sylvania at first did not recognize Vlad's authority, but were soon persuaded to do otherwise. The best of them Vlad made into lesser vampires, so that they could form his bodyguard and be the generals of his army. The other elector counts witnessed the change without interfering, since the new counts seemed far better lords than the Van Dracs. Under Vlad's iron grip, Sylvania was transformed into an efficient province. Vlad ruled over it for 200 years, using different names in different periods, so as not to arouse suspicion over his unnatural longevity. In 2010, Vlad revealed his true nature as a vampire lord, and attacked Stirland at the head of a huge horde, made of the Sylvanian regular army, and countless legions of the living dead. The wars of the vampire counts had begun. Stirland and then Ostermark were devastated. Vlad turned his attention towards the heart of the empire, and for 40 years his armies rampaged through that realm of men. During this long period, the fortunes of the war changed many times. More than once Vlad was cut down by a hero's blade, or lucky cannon shot, and his army suffered severe casualties. Unfortunately for the Empire, the Vampire Count always wore a powerful magic ring that granted him amazing regenerative powers. Vlad always returned from the Netherworld, and the victims of famine, pestilence, and the war were always there to replenish the ranks of his armies. In 2051, after a series of great victories, Vlad's army was immense. The Sylvanians reached Altdorf and laid siege to the greatest city of the empire. The siege lasted months, and the humans were losing all hope. When the last assault came, the great theogenist, Wilhelm III, faced Vlad himself on the battlements of Altdorf. Sensing that he could not win the duel, the theogenist decided to sacrifice his own life in an attempt to destroy the Count. He let Vlad stab him with his sword, and with his last strength, he grabbed Vlad and dragged both of them off the walls. The two figures fell in an embrace of death and impaled themselves on one of the many stakes littering Altdorf's moat. Legends say that Vlad's ring had been stolen from him the night before by the greatest thief in the known world, and that this man had been sent on that mission by the theogenist himself. Others believe that the holy blood of the theogenist, the living incarnation of Sigmar, stopped the vampire from regenerating his mortal wound. Wherever the truth lies, that was the end of the greatest of the vampire counts of Sylvania. With Vlad gone, the Sylvanians were forced to retreat. Over half the vampires were dead, but so great were the casualties inflicted on the men of Altdorf that no pursuit was possible. Within an iron-bound ebony treasure chest, in the tattered remains of the Black Pavilion, were discovered Von Carstein's copies of the 9 books of Nagash and the Liber Mortis. These were hastily placed under lock and key within the Temple of Sigmar. The last casualty of the Battle of Altdorf was Isabella von Carstein. Apparently unable to face eternity without her husband, she impaled herself on a stake and shriveled to dust before the eyes of the would-be Emperor Ludwig and his bodyguard. Ludwig would have used the time to press on into Sylvania and end the evil scourge forever, but the forces of the other 2 claimants to the throne joined against him. They feared that he might use his popularity as the surviving victor of the siege of Altdorf to press his own claim to the throne. That way the pernicious lords of Sylvania were granted an interval to regain their strength. The remaining von Carstein vampires reached Sylvania where they hid to lick their wounds. Soon, a bitter struggle ensued to decide who was to be the new count after Vlad's demise. After years of strife, Conrad von Carstein prevailed. Conrad was a mad and violent individual, feared by his servants as much as his enemies. He immediately launched another campaign against the Empire, in a vain attempt to emulate Vlad's victories. Far less skilled a tactician than his great predecessor, Conrad was stopped at the Battle of the Four Armies in 2100, and finally defeated by a combined dwarf and empire force in the Battle of Grim Moor in 2121. The Count fell fighting against the dwarf hero Gruffbad, and Helmar, the soon-to-be Count of Marienburg. The last of the vampire counts of Sylvania to threaten the Empire was Manfred von Carstein, but the story of this most cunning vampire and his invasion of the Empire is told elsewhere in this book. Suffice to say that eventually his evil plans were thwarted, and after Manfred's defeat, no Von Carstein arose to claim the throne of Sylvania. Nowadays, Sylvania is officially part of Stirland, but in reality is an abandoned territory, where the dead are still easily stirred from their slumber. Many attempts have been made to reclaim this cursed area, but even the promise of free land is not enough to persuade people to settle there. The dark forests of Sylvania are still haunted by unspeakable horrors that prowl the night. The Sylvanian people have long ago learned not to venture out at night, and to hang garlic and demonbane on their windows. During the reign of Karl Franz of Altdorf, rumors are rising in the empire of a new evil power being slowly reborn in Sylvania. Some say that Manfred von Carstein has returned and is gathering huge hordes of the undead once more. Others are sure that a new count has come and begun to rebuild the ancient keep of Drakenhof Castle, the traditional capital of the von Carsteins. The following account, blood-splattered, is unreadable in full. This recording will attempt to capture what is available of the text. For the eyes of the most benevolent Grand Theogenist Volkmar of Altdorf, second of Sigmarzeit, Your Holiness, according to your wishes I have traveled to the, investigating the rumors of the resurgence of the vile undead, residence in Drakenhof Castle, and I have gathered a force of 40, the service of the most holy Sigmar. I am confident that we shall. It has been a long journey and a hard one, and I am pleased to the torch, due to the unmistakable blasphemous rites in which evil. My men and I acquired confessions of witchcraft, demon worship, ultimate sanctions. We cannot tolerate such open displays of black sorcery. Bring Sigmar to these wretches. 23rd of Sigmarzeit. Now, after spending 3 weeks on the accursed roads and paths of these, Drakenhof Castle on the horizon, Sigmar willing, we should be able to. 24th of Sigmarzeit. Coming upon the castle, my suspicions were immediately raised as the ruined battlements. Snarling wolf was flying from the topmost tower. We first encountered resistance on approaching the gates of the castle itself. 5 huge wolves. Nowhere. My own 4 warhounds, brave beasts though they are, whimpered in terror and refused to. Against these hounds from hell, for even after they were mortally wounded, these ghastly creatures refused to, and even then, the bodies continued to twitch, long after any natural animal would have given up its life. The ruins of Drakenhof, and I have set a strong watch for the night. Despite this, I feel uneasy. Unknown day, I beg forgiveness from your holiness, for I have not been able to write for several days. There is little time, and much to say. The following morning I found my sentries dead, their faces ashen with terror, their hair white as if they had aged 50 years in a single night. One of my men wished to abandon our mission, and I was forced to shoot him as he tried to run. The rest of the troops saw the sound reasoning of my argument, and followed me once again to the castle. We entered the gates unopposed, and made our way through the corridors of the castle. Torches and braziers illuminated the hall and chambers, a further proof that someone occupied the castle. Before meeting anyone or anything, we reached the great banquet hall. On the table laid out on a red silk tablecloth was a hideous parody of a nobleman's feast. Carcasses of men and women were laid on the plates, still dripping blood, and the golden goblets were filled with red liquid. I have smelled blood before, and I knew that many men had given up their lives, so those who gathered around this table could drink. At the head of the table sat a tall, gaunt man, dressed in the fashion of the noblemen of old. When we entered, he stood up and smiled, revealing long canine teeth. He spoke to us, confirming my fears. "I am Von Carstein. Welcome to my house. I hope your stay here will be long, very long," he said. I immediately gave the command to attack. Dieter, my adjutant, charged the man claiming to be Von Carstein, but was flung aside, his skull crushed by the force of the blow. I didn't even see when the man struck, so swift was his hand. The abomination drew a sword with a wolf's head guard, and in an instant was in our midst. He had killed 2 before the rest of us could draw our weapons. The blade of Hans, my best swordsman, took him in the chest, and yet he did not go down, but gutted the brave Hocklander with a deadly riposte. Klaus lifted his warhammer, a prayer to Sigmar on his lips, but the Count turned his red eyes on the holy man and spoke a single word. To my horror, I saw the flesh ripped from Klaus's bones, and his skeleton collapsed on the floor. I knew then that we could not stand against such horrors, and ordered a retreat. As we ran, we could hear the mocking laughter of the Count behind us. There is little else to tell, for we fled through the Sylvanian woods, and we were taken one by the pursuers the Count sent after us. Walking corpses, huge blood-sucking bats, and great undead wolves. Now all of my men are dead, or worse, and only I remain, mortally wounded. There is no doubt in my mind that the dread vampire has returned to his abode, and even now he prepares his armies to wreak a terrible revenge on the old world. I will tie this scroll to the collar of my last warhound Stein, and hope that he somehow reaches the capital. I urge your holiness to alert His Majesty the Emperor of the danger. If I am right, we are all in dire peril, and it will only be a matter of time before the vile undead strike west against Stirland and Ostland, as they did 300 years ago. Even in death, I remain your most humble servant, Gunther Stahlberg, witch hunter captain of the secret brethren of Sigmar. Scrawled on top of the letter was a note from the one who recovered it. My Lord Von Carstein, we recovered this letter before it could reach the safety of Stirland. I felt that your lordship would find it amusing. Blood dragons. There was a warrior in the ancient city of Lahmia, greatest among the captains of the king's guard. Handsome, strong, and virtuous, Aborash was a matchless fighter, and he soon caught the eye of Nechrarchs, the queen of Lahmia. Thus Aborash was summoned before the mistress of the Temple of Blood, and he was given a cup to drink from in honor of his queen. When he lifted the cup to his lips, his fate was sealed, and damnation seized him with an iron grip as he drank. His mind filled with visions of death and blood, for he had been given the elixir of life by the queen herself. Soon, The rays of the sun started to sear his skin, and he no longer felt the need for meat or water. Instead, a terrible thirst for the blood of living men started to plague him. Long did Abarash fight the urge to prey upon his people, but the necromantic powers invested in the blood of the queen were too strong, and finally, he succumbed in a single night of rage. Abarash slew 12 men and women. He drained them of blood to quench his unnatural thirst. Only after he had done the deed did he understand what had happened. It is said that Abarash wept tears of blood for his victims, and from that day on, he traveled to the desert to prey upon the scattered nomads instead of his own people. He vowed to learn a discipline to keep his raging thirst under control, and practiced the way of the warrior to harness his great strength under his iron will. Abarash rose quickly in the ranks of the vampire nobility until he became the supreme commander of the Lahmian armies. He was given the honorary title of the Lord of Blood, and busied himself in bringing law and order to the kingdom. While Lahmia was in many ways a city of nightmares, where the ivory-faced aristocrats hunted for blood during the night, there was at least order in the kingdom. Laws were upheld, and bandits were kept in check. The officials were so afraid of their immortal overlords that corruption and bribery became virtually unknown in that land. But the vampire nobles of Lahmia were above the laws enforced by Abarash. Despite his warnings, they often hunted for blood in the lands of other kings. This finally roused the other kingdom's suspicions, and Abarash could only watch as the arrogant vampires roused the rulers of Numas, Zandri, and Rizetra against Lahmia. Then came the day when the kings of Khemri forged the Grand Alliance. Their countless armies marched over the world's edge mountains, and thus war came to Lahmia. For many long months, Abarash led the defense of his homeland and won many battles. But inch by inch, the vast armies of Nechrarchs forced Abarash back. Finally, the gates of Lahmia itself were broken, and the ancient tombs, pyramids, and high spires of Lahmia were toppled. Even the great library was burned down, street by street, building by building. The Khemrian soldiers fought their way towards the Temple of Blood. Here Abarash led the bodyguard of Queen Neferata in a last hopeless defense of the Temple of Blood. But, as fires raged all around him, he was forced to retreat. As the great Temple of Blood collapsed, the keening cry of Abarash echoed throughout the city. He had failed as a warrior, and his beloved city was no more. Abarash was irreversibly changed as he saw his beautiful city razed and his people slaughtered. He vowed to be the enemy of all mankind for eternity. He turned his back to the lands of the south and fought his way through the blazing streets, while the other fleeing vampire lords collected as many treasures and riches from the ruins as they could. Abarash took only his weapons and armor with him to exile. 4 of his vampiric minions followed him. Few of the vampires escaped the pursuit of the vengeful Khemrians. While the other fleeing vampire lords collected as many treasures and riches from the ruins as they could, Abarash took only his weapons and armor with him to exile. 4 of his vampiric minions followed him. Few of the vampires escaped the pursuit of the vengeful Khemrians. Abarash did not join the other immortal aristocrats in their exile. he forsook their company, blaming them for their arrogance, which had brought the armies of Khemri to the gates of Lahmia. The Lord of Blood headed north with his disciples, seeking a sign which would give a new purpose to his existence. Legends say that after many years he came to a great mountain, the pinnacle of which was wreathed in fire. Abarash was strangely drawn to this lonely mountaintop, and ignoring the advice of his followers, he decided to scale its face. As Abarash reached the summit, a red dragon of immense size emerged from the crater and descended on the vampire lord. At the prospect of testing his martial abilities to the full, Abarash drew his sword. For an entire night, Abarash and the great worm fought, and in the end, the vampire was victorious. As the dragon lashed in its death throes, Abarash seized its throat with his fangs and drank deep. Intoxicated by the blood of the dragon, Abarash cast the broken carcass of the creature down from the mountaintop and emitted an exultant cry of victory. His search had ended. Now Abarash no longer craved the lifeblood of men. He had found an escape from the curse of vampirism and had become the ultimate warrior, a man with the strength and powers of a vampire who had no need to hunt for blood. Now he bid his vampiric minions to go forth and hone their martial skills, so that when their prowess equaled his own, they could also escape the curse of vampirism and become free of the predator inside them. Thus he told his cursed followers, "I will watch you, and when I decree that you are ready, I shall call you." Then he bid his warriors go forth, perfect their martial skills, and find others worthy of joining his immortal warriors. Since those days, Abarash's immortal sons have called themselves blood dragons, in memory of the great dragon vanquished by their mighty sire, and they have sought to perfect their martial abilities in order to be worthy enough to rejoin with their master. To this day, the vampires of Abarash's bloodline believe that somewhere, in a dark and shadowy corner of the world, where the face of the sun is pale, Abarash waits for the return of his immortal sons to his mountain home. Of the blood dragons, many became infamous in the kingdom of men. Wallach, of the house of Harkon, the favorite of Abarash's minions, traveled north to the land which men called the Empire. Here he entered the gates of the Blood Keep and challenged the entire order of Templars to single combat. One by one he slew the knights and their men-at-arms. To those he found worthy, he gave a portion of his blood and gifted them the curse of immortality. He reigned over the undead knights until Blood Keep was razed by the Templars and witch hunters of the Empire. Though the Knights of Blood Keep are by far the most famous of the vampire warriors, they are by no means the only sons of Abarash. In the lands of Telea, Estalia, Araby, and Bretonia, there are also legends of vampire knights. The most infamous of them was the legendary Red Duke, the Scourge of Aquitaine. This mighty and fell vampire lord rose in the land of Bretonia, and only after the fierce and bloody battle of Seren Fields did the ruler of Aquitaine vanquish his undead legions. But though his army was destroyed, the Red Duke escaped, and many believe that he still lurks in the mountains or trackless forests of Bretonia. And who can say where else blood dragons can be found? perhaps in the guise of a proud hermit warrior, living high in the mountains, perfecting his martial disciplines. How many matchless assassins hide ivory skin and the fangs of a predator behind their masks? How many knights of the secluded Templar order are, in reality, immortal creatures of darkness? Blood dragons can be found guarding places such as bridges and fords, challenging all who pass to test their mettle. Blood dragons strive for perfection and practice different fighting styles unceasingly, but the rage inside them rarely gives them peace. Unlike the pernicious vampire lords of Sylvania, the blood dragons never attempt to gain supremacy over entire nations, nor do they try to raise huge armies, preferring forces consisting of white men-at-arms to act as hideous parodies of the retinues of mortal nobles. The principles and ideals of the blood dragon are more concerned with the martial prowess of individuals, rather than with attempting to create empires. But when challenged to come to war, the blood dragons are terrible in their wrath. Though less powerful than many other lords of undeath in the art of necromancy, they can still summon undead hordes to fight for them, and their prowess in combat is second to none. Lambert de Lilaz was riding along a narrow path in the very heart of the forest of Chalon. Under the dense foliage, the light of day was reduced to a gray haze, but following the tracks left by the one he was hunting was not difficult. It seemed that no attempt at all had been made to conceal them. Alas, what an arrogant villain this must be who did not fear the rightful vengeance of the knights of Bretonnia. Only that morning during his long quest for the Grail, Lambert had passed through a woodcutter's village at the edge of the forest. The poor men living there had pleaded with him to save them from the Red Knight of Chalon. They told him in despair how this terrible warrior had ridden into their village over the last 4 nights to abduct their sons and daughters. He was clad in a blood-red suit of armor and mounted on a huge black warhorse. The device on his shield was that of a coiled black dragon on a red field. Lambert recognized him as one of the cursed Knights of Blood. Certainly he thought this was a trial set by the lady on his quest for the Grail, and so he had entered the dark forest. In the dim light of the sunset, the path led him to a clearing, and there he was, standing tall and proud in the center of the small glade. The vampire seemed to be waiting for him. He was wearing no helm, and Lambert could see his long mane of thin black hair that contrasted so intensely with his pale complexion and crimson plate armor. The Knight of Blood smiled enigmatically, examining Lambert as he made his way into the clearing. "I am Lambert de Lilaz, Knight of Bretonnia. Mount your steed and prepare to fight. May the lady give me the strength to strike you down and put an end to your evil deeds," sounded the proud challenge of the questing knight. After a few seconds of tense silence, the Red Knight spoke in a calm and confident voice. "You should not be so concerned about the fate of those commoners, young Lambert. They are not worth what you are risking, and this fight is meaningless. You have no hope of defeating me, and I have no interest in such an uneven confrontation. Furthermore, I am already sated with the blood of those peasants, and I do not need to take your life. Ride away, boy." What arrogance, thought Lambert, a deep rage overcoming his reason. He lowered his lance and spurred on his warhorse,
charging the vampire with the cry of, "For the lady and the king!" The Red Knight did not move a muscle, and Lambert's lance found its mark. The steel tip of his lance pierced the red armor, and the shaft buried itself deep in the undead warrior's flesh. The lance shattered as the knight galloped by his opponent. The Bretonnian was immediately filled by a sense of triumph. Nothing could withstand such a terrible impact. He had vanquished the abomination. Lambert halted his warhorse and turned it around. The vampire was still standing. The lance had penetrated his chest just under the collarbone, and the tip was now protruding from below his shoulder blade. The creature turned slowly towards Lambert, pulled the thick wooden shaft out of his body, and dropped it with an unnatural nonchalance. Only a very thin stream of blood trickled from his gaping wound.
"A good jousting display, Knight of Bretonnia, but I told you that you cannot win this combat. I will not repeat myself again. Now leave and live."
Lambert was astonished by the resilience of the vampire. He felt a strong urge to flee as far as possible from such a powerful enemy. But he controlled his fear and answered, "Perhaps you are right, creature of the night. Perhaps I cannot defeat you. But I am a knight, and I will not surrender. Death is preferable to cowardice. Defend yourself." Drawing his sword, Lambert spurred his steed once more. When he reached the enemy, he swung his sword in a wide, deadly arc, with all the strength of his arm and his charging warhorse. This time the vampire reacted. With blinding speed, his left hand raised and caught Lambert's wrist in an iron grasp, while the right stopped the charging warhorse. The sudden halt in their impetus shocked both the animal and the young knight, and they found themselves immobilized and helpless, at the mercy of that unnatural predator. For a second, the eyes of the two knights met. Looking into those two pools of ancient darkness, Lambert understood that there were powers in the world against which he could not prevail. Then the vampire unhorsed Lambert with a twist of his powerful arm, and flung him like a puppet into the trees. The Bretonnian crashed against a trunk, and darkness engulfed him. When Lambert opened his eyes, surprised that he was still alive, the Red Knight was in front of him, a sad smile on his thin lips. Lambert realized he had been thrown over the saddle of his own horse. He tried to move, but his body was overwhelmed by pain, and his muscles would not respond to his will.
"I am sparing your life, Lambert. You fought with courage, and I'm going to leave this forest. You have saved your precious peasants, so your pride is intact. Now let your good steed take you to the village. There you will rest and heal, so that you can continue your quest. If you complete it, you will become a more interesting opponent, and maybe we will have a fairer duel if we meet again. My name is Caleb, of the Order of the Blood Dragon, and if you learnt something from today's experience, you will not come after me before you are truly ready. Fare thee well, Knight of Bretonnia."
After the vampire disappeared into the darkness, Lambert realized that he had indeed learnt something. He had been taught a hard but necessary lesson. Only now did he understand that he was lacking one of the most important knightly virtues. To reach perfection and to see the Grail, a knight needed humility. He praised the lady for this revelation,
and then slipped once more into unconsciousness. Caleb observed the vanquished young knight until his horse had taken him out of sight. The vampire couldn't help feeling that in the future he would meet Lambert again, and that he might come to regret not having killed him now. He had fought enough Grail Knights to learn not to underestimate them, but something in his tainted blood stopped him from taking any pride in defeating a knight in an uneven fight. Also, that boy reminded him of a distant past, of a time when he was not doomed to drink the blood of men to survive. The Knight of Blood shrugged off those uneasy feelings, mounted his black charger, and went on his way out of the forest. The light of the full moon caught a reflection on Caleb's shield, revealing just for an instant his old device, a blazon which long ago had been covered by the blood dragon icon. It was a fleur-de-lis. Nechrarchs. Like all vampires, the origin of the Nechrarchs can be traced to the ancient city of Lahmia, where they once ruled as undying overlords of that distant land. It is thought that the Nechrarchs claim descent from Wissoran, who they revere as the father of vampires. Perhaps he was a scholar and alchemist in the forgotten time when the Nechrarchans studied the black arts in their quest to cheat death. No one knows for sure, as so little is known about these ancient times. With the fall of Lahmia, the kingdom of vampires came to an end, and the great library of Lahmia was burned to the ground. The accumulated knowledge of ancient Nehekhara was destroyed, and many of the disciples of Wissoran died in the flames, reluctant to abandon their work. Unfortunately for the world, a handful of Nechrarchs fled and survived the pursuit of the armies of the kings of Numas and Zandri, taking with them books, scrolls, and other fragments of the dark lore that Nagash had created. They scattered all over the world and hid themselves to patiently wait for the death of their enemies and continue their studies. They built tall towers from which they could study the stars and defend themselves if attacked. From their towers, the Nechrarchs cast great spells during the dark nights of Geheimisnacht. The purpose of these sorceries is always the same: to kill all living things within the reach of the Nechrarch magic. From their dark abodes, corruption slowly spreads, poisoning rivers, withering forests, and causing animals and men to sicken and die. It seems that the Nechrarchs are determined to strangle all life from the known world. Those who study such things suspect the hand of the great necromancer Nagash the Black himself, behind the slow corrupting work of the Nechrarchs. It is known that this dread necromancer desires to turn the whole world into a kingdom of the dead, in which no living creature walks under the sun, and only undead eternally bound to his service remain. Such a world would have an eternal order without change, growth, or life. This is why the witch hunters revile the Nechrarchs above all other vampires, and spare no effort trying to eradicate them. Finding these elusive creatures is the most difficult task a vampire slayer can set himself. Only very rarely do the Nechrarchs openly march to war, but at such times they are perhaps more dangerous than any other lords of undeath. For with their necromantic lore, the Nechrarchs can raise huge armies of undead. Such wars are fought not for earthly gain or temporal power, but rather for acquiring knowledge and magical lore. The folk of Astalia still shudder when they remember the wars of death, when Norgal, the terrible Vampiro of Astalia, marched against them. His undead armies, marshaled over long millennia, numbered in tens of thousands, and crushed the proud condottieri of Astalia, leaving thousands dead. The whole war was fought over the possession of a single book, the Tomb of Wisdom, which was kept in the Temple of Myrmidia. Luckily for the world, the vampire lord was killed in the temple just as he acquired the book, but it took decades for Astalia to recover. Nechrarchs are incomprehensible even to their own undead brethren, and most seem utterly insane. Their madness is tempered by their undeniable genius and mastery of alchemy and necromantic magic. Whereas many vampires seek dominion over the kingdoms of men either by cunning or might of arms, the Nechrarchs wish to see the end of all living things. They differ from their immortal brothers in many other aspects. The most obvious is their appearance. They are reeking, rotting wizards, and few men can gaze at their horrifying visage without trembling. Nechrarchs are as horrible to behold as the enchanting Lahmians are beautiful. The other differences are subtler, but perhaps more important. Of all the vampires, the Nechrarchs can resist extremely long periods of time without the blood of men to sustain themselves. How they defy that which dominates the existence of all other vampires is unknown, but their secret has probably something to do with their mastery of the necromantic arts. While most vampires must continually hunt for the blood of men, with the risk of being revealed for what they are, Nechrarchs can hide far from prying eyes and concentrate upon their study of black magic. The Nechrarchs do not see the world as do other vampires. To them, the world of the living is but a blurred image, while the world of the dead, the bodies in their graves, the corpses and overflowing charnel houses, are crystal clear and far more real than the mortal world filled with life. Nechrarchs are loners. They are alchemists and sorcerers whom few can match. In the arts of black sorcery, they have no equals among vampires, and this more than compensates for their fighting skills, which are poor in comparison with those of other vampires. Hidden in secluded towers and dens, protected by sorceress wards, and guarded by their undead servants, the Nechrarchs devote their eternal lives to the study of necromantic magic. Witch hunters and knights errant seek these abodes, and when they uncover the den of a Nechrarch, bitter battle ensues. Often those who would slay the vampires end up serving their enemies in a ghastly unlife. Nechrarchs value their privacy above all else. Still, even Nechrarchs at times need blood, or the bodies of living creatures, to sacrifice in their magical rituals and experiments. This means that they need agents in human society. As physical beauty has little value to the Nechrarchs, they accept the services of those who others scorn: the diseased, the mad, the disfigured and mutated. The Nechrarchs show false pity to these outcasts, and in return their servants are frantically faithful, and are capable of performing tasks which the vampires would find difficult. During daylight hours, these dregs rob graveyards and plague pits in order to find raw materials for their masters' experiments. The most intelligent of these, The Nechrarchs school in the art of necromancy. Rarest of all are those who the Nechrarchs decide to initiate into their own ranks as new thralls. Because of their rarity, many scholars doubt whether the Nechrarchs really exist, but in the darkest places of the world, hidden from the eyes of men, the Nechrarchs continue their slow, insidious work. One day, their labors will bear fruit, and the world will know horror unlike any before. The spiral stairway to the crypt was ancient and dank. Shadows danced on the walls at the light of Nero's lantern. He reached to the bottom of the staircase and tore his way through the cobwebs obstructing the archway. Nero entered the room and at once felt that he was no longer stepping on a stone floor. The room was covered in moist soil, the foul mold of that accursed forest. That was how the vampires recovered their supernatural energies in their daily slumber. They needed to lie in the womb of that evil land. Then he saw the coffin and froze, holding his breath. Inch by inch he approached. After reaching it, he put down his lantern and prepared his wooden stake and mallet for the job he had come to do. He slowly removed the lid of the coffin, and empty. There was no trace of the body. He had been fooled. Yet something small moved suddenly in the furthest end of the coffin. Nero raised his lantern. The creature it illuminated was born out of a nightmare. It was a rotten human head, standing on 8 articulated legs like those of a huge spider. Certainly this was one of the experiments of the Dark Master of the Tower. The creature hissed a disgusting, "Master!" and scuttled towards a dark corner of the room. Nero moved a few steps in that direction and saw a great stone sarcophagus carved in strange symbols. They reminded him of the scrolls from the ancient kingdom of Khemri that he had studied in the past. Before he could make a move, the heavy slab covering the sarcophagus fell aside with a loud thud. Then, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, moved out of it and into the chamber. The air seemed to chill in the crypt. The only detail Nero could clearly see were the eyes of the vampire, 2 gleaming jewels of ancient evil. "So, miserable mortal, you thought you could catch Nicodemus unprepared?" whispered a voice from the darkness, a voice that reached Nero's innermost fears and overwhelmed his senses with sheer horror. Nero gave a shrieking cry of frustrated anger, immediately followed by a series of arcane words of power. From his eyes erupted 2 black rays of pure dark magic that struck the vampire and seemed to engulf him. The creature was surprised by the violence of the attack, hardly managing to disperse the dark energies that threatened to destroy him. Nicodemus raised his arms and enchanted aloud in the language of his long-lost homeland. Answering his call, a dozen skeleton warriors clawed their way up out of the crypt's floor and started to move towards Nero. As the circle closed, a strange smile appeared on the thin lips of the human. "Wrong move, Nicodemus." Nero assumed the same posture as the vampire and uttered a series of commanding words. The skeletons stopped their advance. Nicodemus felt his control on the mindless servants fading, his sorcery challenged by another powerful mind.
He struggled to maintain control of his minions, and the two wizards, the living and the undead, started a titanic battle of wills. Nicodemus could feel the vast flow of dark magic that his opponent was channeling, and at the same time, the subtle level of control he was using in an attempt to exploit any gap in Nicodemus's defenses. How was that possible? Since when had his student reached such a high level of mastery? Slowly the skeletons turned and began to advance towards their creator. Nero started to laugh aloud. "You are defeated, pathetic monster. You have lost your arrogance all of a sudden. I am the master now." The vampire moved back until he was pressed against the wall, and then made a last attempt to regain control of the skeletons. Nero moved forward and kept the pressure high. He almost felt pity for the rotten monster that had once been his master, and who was now desperately cornered in his own crypt, betrayed by his best apprentice. Then, the vampire abruptly ceased the struggle. Nero was surprised by this apparent surrender, and stared at his former master with suspicion. Was he really going to give up? Nicodemus spoke in a slow, patronizing tone. "I see that your knowledge of the black arts has grown to an impressive level, but you must consider you are just a human, and humans are fragile. Their life is so easily crushed out of their weak bodies. Don't you think that in your eagerness to defeat me, you have come a bit too close?" Then, the vampire darted towards Nero, literally moving through the skeletons, which exploded as if they were made of fragile clay when the creature hit them. Too late, Nero realized his mistake. When he was young in Teleia, he had heard legends of the great strength of the Lords of the Night, but he had never seen that in his former teacher, who resembled a rotting carcass. He had never imagined that Nicodemus could move so fast, never imagined that he could burst through the skeletons so easily, never imagined that those wizened hands could break his neck so quickly. The vampire threw away the broken puppet that was Nero's body as the skeletons collapsed to the ground. Then he staggered back towards his sarcophagus. Rest. He needed to rest. The human had wisely attacked in the middle of the day, when Nicodemus's powers were at their weakest. The vampire could feel the presence of the sun, even this deep underground. After putting the heavy lid back in place, and before falling into his deep slumber, Nicodemus reflected on what had happened. How was it possible that a mere scholar, a creature that had been learning necromancy for such a short time, how long had it been anyway? Maybe 30 years? Could have become a match for his powers. The vampire had studied the black arts for thousands of years. He had been taught by the great necromancer himself. He who challenged death and created the discipline of undeath. How was it possible? Humans were weak. How could they challenge the mastery of one of the line of Wissorin? He clearly remembered the flame of Nero's life extinguished by the force of his own grasp as the human passed away. Only then did Nicodemus understand. There was the answer. That was the reason why humans could progress in the necromantic arts faster than any vampire. Humans were obsessed with the fear of dying, of passing away from the world and disappearing. Their lifespan was so short that they had to find a way to cheat death in the space of a few decades. The blood kiss brings immortality to vampires, but immortality also means that vampires lose that most powerful driving force, the fear of death. At this revelation, Nicodemus at first was dismayed, but then he started to think of the problem as a challenge. He needed to find another apprentice so that he could study him much more closely. Maybe there was something that could be learned from the humans he used to prey upon. From that night on, Nicodemus would experiment on his victims with a new and refreshed scholar's interest. The Strigoi. When the vampire lords of old escaped the destruction of Lahmia and fled north, Ushoran, the Lord of Masks, was among them. A most powerful and proud vampire lord, he soon challenged the other lords for supremacy. However, they resisted him and decided that nobody should rule over them anymore. They preferred to go further north and then divide, free to follow their own different paths to damnation. Ushoran was furious. He spitefully rejected them, cursed them all, and then left. He guided his few remaining minions to the west, toward a small kingdom of men. Strigos was the name of this kingdom, in the western foothills of the World's Edge Mountains, where the blind river reaches the plains. The capital of this realm was the great walled city of Morcaine, which can be found on some ancient imperial maps under the name of Morgheim. In a few centuries, the children of the Lord of Masks were holding many positions of importance in the city, and Ushoran eventually took over the kingdom and ruled over the Strigoi for many centuries thereafter. He was worshipped as a deity by his human subjects in a way that was reminiscent of the ancient cult of blood in Lahmia. A few men, chosen from amongst the nobility, were given eternal life as vampires, and they formed Ushoran's closest ministers and the high priests of his cult. Once more, human sacrifices were consumed in moonless nights, but wisely, Ushoran and his priests always chose their victims from among captured enemies, slaves and criminals, so that the people of Strigos never felt threatened by their terrible masters. But to rule in peace was not to be the final destiny of this line of vampires. It was when the armies of Strigos were engaged in the north of the kingdom, fighting off a raid from one of the neighboring human kingdoms, that disaster struck. Out of the World's Edge Mountains erupted a huge green-skin Wah. The ravening orcs engulfed the rich plains of Strigos, annihilated the border patrols, and soon laid siege to Morcaine itself. When news of the attack reached Ushoran, who was leading his army in the north, he immediately turned back to defend his capital. At the Battle of the Plain of Dust, the already depleted army of Strigos clashed with the uncountable orcs beneath the walls of the city. After a long and bloody fight, the Strigoi were defeated and retreated in desperation toward the city walls. When the powerful orc shaman who was leading the horde saw that the gates of the city had been opened to allow the remnants of the routed army into the city, he seized the moment and launched an all-out attack against the gate defenses. A massive orc chief and the shaman, both mounted on great wyverns, fell on the beleaguered humans at the city entrance. At these gates, the fate of Morcaine was to be decided, for it was there that Ushoran decided to make his last stand. The duel between the orcs and the vampire lord was epic, but eventually, The undead noble succumbed to the mighty powers of the shaman and was destroyed. His dying scream is still said to echo at night in the sinister ruins of the great city of Morcaine. Then the orcs turned to the capital and razed it to the ground, butchering or enslaving all the population. This once proud kingdom was completely wiped from history, and now the area that it occupied goes under the name of the Badlands. The few survivors who escaped the orcs' devastation are now a scattered nomadic people known as Strigoi, traveling through the human kingdoms in small caravans and living off expediencies. Their myths and legends still remember the golden age when the undying king was reigning over a rich and powerful Strigos, and they prophesize that one day he will return and guide his people to reclaim their ancient land and rebuild its splendor. Not all the Strigoi vampires were destroyed with Usharan. Some survived and fled to the human kingdoms in the north. In need of help, they searched for others of their kind and eventually found them in the forests of Sylvania. But the proud Count von Carstein still remembered the spiteful arrogance of Usharan and turned on his minions, hunting them down like animals in the woods. After that episode of bloody betrayal, the few remaining Strigoi scattered across the old world. Whenever they met vampires of different lines, they received the same treatment they had endured from the von Carsteins. Soon, the Strigoi vampires had to hide from the wrath of their own kin, and turned to a life of scavenging at the borders of human society. From the darkness of gutters, woods, and abandoned buildings, they would spy on the Lahmian and von Carstein vampires at the balls and banquets of the aristocracy. Their beauty, nobility, and wealth reminded the miserable Strigoi of what they had lost, and hatred and envy started to devour their minds. They began to feel the same towards the martial blood dragons and powerful Nechrarchs, who regarded the Strigoi respectively as a challenging enemy to slay in a duel, or as an interesting specimen to dissect in their laboratories. The Strigoi slowly transformed into desperate creatures, hated both by the living and by the other vampires. In their desolation, many of them lost their minds completely and became solitary, pathetic creatures, afraid of feeding on humans for fear of attracting the attention of the witch hunters, or even worse, of other vampires. For this reason, they hid in graveyards, digging out recently buried corpses to drink their cold blood, and hiding during the day in the dank crypts and gutters near their feeding ground. Their physical appearance soon started to reflect their miserable condition, as they turned into hunched, grotesque monstrosities. The more bestial traits of their race soon prevailed, and eradicated any semblance of human appearance. Even if most of them have to some degree lost their minds, they still possess many of the innate powers that all vampires have. Their authority over the living dead and the myriad creatures of the night is still strong. They have not lost the power to raise the dead from their slumber and bind them to their will, but they do so in their own instinctual way. Even if their magic is less subtle than the more refined forms of necromancy practiced by the other vampires, it is no less powerful. Packs of flesh-eating ghouls are attracted to these lonely creatures, and often form grotesque courts around them. Grave robbers and those vile men who gather on battlefields to steal from the bodies of the fallen have learned all too well that they must do their deeds before nightfall, and then leave. With darkness, different kinds of scavengers always fall on these places of death. Swarms of ghouls, led by massive, fast, and deadly night hunters, Strigoi vampires. It is little wonder that the people of the old world refer to the Strigoi as the Ghoul Kings. The same superstitious people accuse the wandering Strigani of being in contact with these dangerous creatures, of worshipping and serving them. It is said that the nomads sometimes kidnap children to offer them to the Ghoul Kings, in a parody of the rituals of ancient Strigos. Others are sure that the Strigani help the Strigoi vampires to move from town to town in their caravans, contributing to spread this evil plague. These rumors, usually completely false, have cost the Strigani dearly, since they are often persecuted, rejected, and killed for no other reason than this reputation. Strigoi vampires are rare, and found mostly in the southern provinces of the Empire, in Tilea and the border princes. They seem to be somehow attracted towards the Badlands, towards Strigos of old. At times, powerful Strigoi vampires raise a vast army of the living dead around themselves and push south, in a desperate attempt to recreate the kingdom they once had and lost. They have always been stopped, so far. The last group of gutter runners which Kreesqueek had sent to explore the access ways to the sewers of Miragliano had returned. The black-clad assassin and his Eshin acolytes had been hired by a warrior clan and sent on a mission to poison the water reservoir of the city in preparation for a full-scale assault.
South entrance closed, master. Heavy gate, new gate. Smell of man things around. Sewer guards, bad. East gate, same, master,
confirmed the second party. A snarl of frustration revealed the razor-sharp teeth of the assassin as he turned towards the leader of the last group.
West gate, same there. Speak. No, master. West gate abandoned, old and rusty. Weak, but,
snarled the assassin.
Master, tunnel runs through place, where man things put dead in ground. Ah, graves. Never understood man things. Why waste food like that? No guards and rusty gate. Perfect, concluded the assassin. But, master, smelled dead man things there. Walking dead. Bah! Worse than man things in a fight. Just smell bad. Control your fear. We go there.
The cemetery was ancient and had probably been abandoned by humans for many centuries. Vines, mold, and lichen had taken over the place, and many tombstones were cracked or fallen. The keen eyes of the assassin, to whom the moonless night was as clear as full daylight, inspected the place. Immediately he noticed that many tombs had been dug up, the earth lying heaped all around, as if a pack of animals had clawed their way to the bodies underground. Or perhaps as if the occupants of the coffins had decided to dig their way up from below. These were telltale signs of the presence of the living dead. But Kreesqueek had a mission to accomplish, and so decided to proceed. He far preferred to face the undead than have to inform the Night Lord that he had failed to carry out his orders. The Skaven scuttled silently through the old and sinister graveyard, searching for the crypt that would allow them access to the sewer system of Miragliano.
"That one,"
whispered the assassin, pointing at a small, domed building, festooned with derelict statues and carrying the emblem of the noble family Bission.
"Our passage in there."
The gutter runners were approaching the dark stairs leading down when a weird noise rose from deep underground. It was an extremely high-pitched scream, assaulting the fine senses of the Skaven and forcing them to cover their ears with their paws. The scream stopped as abruptly as it had begun. A strange feeling of cold and dread immediately struck the Ratmen. The fur on the back of their necks stood on end, and their hearts quickened. The musk of fear filled the air. Then, the undead attacked. Stumbling skeleton warriors emerged from the crypt and the mausoleums around them, rusty blades and shields in their grisly hands. The Skaven hesitated and seemed on the verge of breaking into a run, but Kreesqueek did not lose his cool.
"Don't run. You flee. I kill you. Everyone fight, fight. They die easy."
To demonstrate, he hurled a throwing star right through the neck of a skeleton. The skull of the thing fell to the ground, and after a second the rest of its bones simply exploded. Bolstered by the assassin's presence, the gutter runners swallowed their fear, drew their swords, and attacked. The assassin smiled. He wondered if any of his underlings realized that the devastating effect of his throwing star had been due to the powdered warpstone in the poison that coated Kreesqueek's weapons. Well, at least now they were fighting. The assassin knew that his opponent's greatest weapon was the fear they inspired, and that they were next to useless at close quarters. The fight was soon over. The well-trained adepts of Clan Eshin had destroyed all the necromantic creations, receiving only a few minor wounds in return.
"Told you. Easy, easy. Too slow for Clan Eshin. Now, move in."
The gutter runners started their descent into the dank crypt, and soon reached a large underground chapel.
"Entrance under altar,"
whispered the assassin.
"Across the place. This way. Wait."
This time the attack was much more sudden and unexpected. From their hiding places in the alcoves and behind the pillars of the chapel, bestial humanoid creatures jumped on the Skaven, snarling ferociously.
"Ghouls!"
shouted Kreesqueek, drawing his 2 weeping blades and throwing himself into the fray. This was a very different fight. The ghouls were not as slow as the skeletons. Their attack was ferocious. Even though the gutter runners were more skilled and better armed, the bodies of these foul creatures seemed impervious to pain, and the slightest scratch from their poisonous claws and fangs could prove fatal. Soon, several Skaven lay on the ground, their bodies twitching in death spasms. The Ratmen would have probably been overwhelmed if Kreesqueek hadn't been there, but the formidable assassin made all the difference in the fight. The Eshin master moved with uncanny speed, his deadly warpstone blades cutting left and right, leaving behind a pile of mutated corpses. After a few minutes, the ghouls' ferocity vanished under Kreesqueek's onslaught, and the scavengers ran away, massing towards the far end of the hall. Led by the assassin, the 3 remaining gutter runners pursued them, only to stop, puzzled, when they saw what the ghouls were intent on. The creatures had gathered around a massive marble sarcophagus,
lying behind the main altar, and were now frantically hitting its lid and scratching at it with their claws, squealing and snarling in fear, as if calling for help. The heavy lid fell to the side, moved aside easily by a taloned hand that emerged from within. A creature rose from the sarcophagus, and all the ghouls crouched on the floor in awe. The stench of death and ancient decay filled the hall. The Skaven began to back off, staring at this new monstrosity, which was in many ways similar to the ghouls around it, yet somehow different. This one was larger, more powerful, its body deformed and twisted, with traits that reminded the Skaven of the bats which shared their tunnels. But it was the glowing green eyes of the beast, filled with a kind of deranged evil intelligence, which made the gutter runners think that it regarded them merely as prey. Suddenly, emitting a piercing shriek, the creature attacked at an unbelievable speed. 2 Skaven were impaled by the huge claws of the monster before they could raise their weapons to defend themselves. The other turned to run, but he too was grasped and torn in two by the powerful hands of the monster. Kreesqueek was too good a fighter to turn his back on such an opponent, and kept his guard up, ready for anything. The creature stooped down, and keeping his eyes on the Skaven leader, started to drink deeply from the broken bodies of the gutter runners. Kreesqueek now understood what he was facing.
Vampire,
thought the assassin.
That's why no man-things come here.
The thing suddenly jumped and attached itself to the ceiling of the chapel, its obscene head turned completely backwards so as not to lose sight of the assassin for a single instant. Kreesqueek moved a few cautious steps back in the direction of the entrance. Then he froze. He could smell the ghouls closing the circle behind him like well-coordinated predators. Kreesqueek realized that he had to try to kill the vampire. It was his only chance. The vampire was looking intently at the Skaven's swords from the dark ceiling. The vague green halo surrounding the weapons was a warning to the undead creature, for it remembered tasting the bite of similar weapons long ago, and did not want to repeat the experience. The ghouls were too close now, and Kreesqueek made his move. A throwing star darted towards the vampire, but the thing deflected it with a claw, and answered by hissing a series of arcane words. A clenched finger pointed at the assassin. At first, Kreesqueek couldn't perceive any change, but soon, the weeping blades he carried seemed to become heavier and more difficult to hold, as his arms started to shake. When he tried to move, he felt his body sluggish and slow. With horror, the assassin saw the fur on the back of his paw turning gray and start to fall off. His was not a long-living race, and the necromantic powers unleashed against him were turning every second into a month. He was dying. Kreesqueek panicked and turned to run, but his collapsing body couldn't sustain him and he fell, never to rise again. While the ghouls feasted on the bodies of the gutter runners, the Strigoi vampire picked up the swords of the assassin from the pile of dust and bones which were all that were left of the Skaven. For a while the creature admired the weapons, fascinated by the green, crackling energies playing on the blades. Then he retired to a dark alcove, where he dropped the weeping blades on a heap of weapons, jewels, and other arcane objects, which he had collected during the long centuries of his existence. A strange smile split his deformed face.
One new present for Ramatep. Nice, shiny present,
whispered the monster, rubbing its taloned hands together and tittering maniacally in the dark. The living dead. Vampires. Vampires are the lords of the dead, and all the vampires in the old world are descendants of one of the great masters. The story of the vampires in the old world is told elsewhere in this tome, but it is sufficient to say that men dread these mighty creatures for a good reason. Vampires are immortals, with great powers, and require only blood to sustain themselves. They are physically far stronger than any living man, and can endure wounds that would slay mere mortals in an instant. They have a natural ability to command necromantic magic, and to bind undead things to their will. The greatest among them are also able to command the skies, so that when their armies march to battle, the skies darken with heavy storm clouds. This casts dismay in the hearts of the mortals facing the undead, and protects the vampires and their minions from the touch of the sunlight, which is the bane of their kind. Necromancers. Necromancers are wizards who have turned to the dark arts to seek escape from death. They study this perverted magic which grants them power over the dead, allowing them to commune with spirits and to raise corpses to serve them. They are shunned and hated by society, and are often insane and morbid. Many necromancers are allies and subjects of vampires, whether willingly or not. Sooner or later, their bodies start to rot away, and they eventually lose what's left of their humanity and join the ranks of the undead as undying wizards. Skeletons. The battlefields of the old world are strewn with the graves of many nameless warriors who have fallen in combat and been consigned to a hasty resting place, or left upon the ground amidst the carnage. Even in death, there is no rest for the fallen warriors, for they can be summoned back to the world of the living by black sorcery. All that these once dead fighters can recall of their mortal life are faint memories of battles fought long ago. All that they feel is the compulsion to fight, and to obey their masters as they did when they were alive. A mortal who dares fight against an army of skeletons is confronted by a ghastly apparition, for who could remain unafraid when faced with the remains of long-dead warriors lurching towards them? Zombies. Zombies are corpses brought back from the dead by foul necromancy. Their necromantic overlords drive them into battle in their thousands, using them to exhaust the armies of their enemies. Zombies are poor fighters, but they never give up and will push against their enemies in a huge, engulfing mass. The flesh of a zombie is rank, blotched with rot, and riven with maggots and worms. Their skin hangs from their bodies in strips, revealing unbeating hearts and veins through which no blood flows. Terrible balefires burn in their putrefying eyes, and they are gripped by an urge to kill and devour all living things. Some zombies are decayed and rotten to the point where they are little more than skeletons, while others bear a terrifying resemblance to the recently deceased. Wights. Wights are long-dead heroes who are tied to the land of the living by magic. In ages past, the men of the old world buried their dead beneath mounds of earth and stone, together with their battle gear and worldly wealth. Although their bodies have decayed, Whites are held together by evil magic so strong that it can last for many centuries. They wear ancient armor of bronze and black iron, corroded by time and dusty with the years. They carry iron weapons inlaid with evil runes, an accursed parody of once powerful magical blades. Some vampires rule over entire regiments of whites, warriors who dared challenge them in life and now serve them in death. Their ranks are often joined by one of the kings of old, returned from his tomb to lead them as a white lord. Ghouls. When the lean and hungry times of famine come upon the old world, the inbred hamlets of Sylvania took to feasting on corpses. These cannibals were driven mad by the meat of the dead, and over the years degenerated into a race that is no longer human. Driven by an unspeakable craving for human flesh, they dwell near graveyards, digging up the corpses of the recently buried and consuming the cold flesh. Ghouls are stooped and disgusting creatures. Their skin is blotched and filthy, their eyes bestial, and their snarling lips reveal rows of sharpened teeth. When the armies of undead gather, ghouls scuttle from their hiding places to join them. Vampires and necromancers are their masters, and ghouls fear their wrath, enough to obey their commands. Banshees. Banshees are the restless spirits of evil women. Their shades linger in the material world, fearing to cross the void to face punishment for their evil deeds. Banshees howl in bitterness and remembrance of when the pleasures of life were theirs. Their wail is lethal to mortals, and those who do not have a will of iron may die of sheer horror upon hearing it. Their visage is skull-like and twisted, eternally frozen in a grimace of agony and everlasting pain. Their great mane of hair flows around them like a black cloud. They float above the ground and are surrounded by an eerie glow of delights, shades of the men who they murdered during their lifetime. Spirit hosts. The dead do not rest easy in the old world. Ghosts, shades, and specters of dead men return to haunt the land of the living. On certain nights, these lost souls can be seen hovering above the places of their death, shimmering with unnatural light. Only very few know the secret rituals that can bind the spirits of the dead. But some vampires and the most twisted of necromancers hold that knowledge. They can summon these miserable creatures and unleash them upon their enemies. Spirits gather together into vast hosts when summoned, and advance on the field of battle, silent and incorporeal, but no less frightening, because their touch is enough to freeze the hearts of mortals. Wraiths. Wraiths are the spirits of evil men who dabbled in the necromantic arts during their lives. Desperate to keep themselves alive, they used enchantments to preserve their spirits. Some succeeded in living beyond death as necromancers, but the willpower of most is not sufficient to maintain a physical form, and over the years they wither away to nothing. Now, all that remains are the cloaks that give them substance, their bodies having long since rotted away. Hating all life, but fearing death more, they cling to their tragic existence, hovering between life and death as miserable spirits who hunger for the warmth and flesh of mortals. Fell bats, also known as vampire bats, the blood-drinking bats of Sylvania, grow to monstrous proportions. some with wingspans 12 feet or more. They are nightmarish predators of the dark, silent and deadly. They exist solely on the blood of the living, that of men being their favorite. The scholars of the old world speculate that perhaps an ancestor of these beasts drank the blood of a vampire, and thus joined the ranks of the undead. Bat swarms. When the armies of the vampires march to war, the skies above them are obscured by multitudes of bats. Driven by the will of the vampires, hundreds of these animals descend on their enemies and attack them ferociously, often buying enough time for the undead army to close in. Dire wolves. The land of Sylvania is plagued by giant wolves, which emerge in winter from their lairs high in the World's Edge Mountains to destroy entire villages. The men of the Empire hunt these beasts mercilessly, but this is not always enough. Even from beyond the grave, these awful creatures return to terrorize men. The carcasses of these wolves are buried in great pits, but the cursed earth of Sylvania does not allow them to rest. Often they burrow their way through the rotting layers of earth and emerge to hunt once more. These undead wolves are the hunting packs of vampires, and gather around the casteless of the vampire lords to follow the princes of undeath to war. Dire wolves have skull-like heads and rotting black fur. Their eyes glow with unnatural light, and their bodies dissolve into nothing when they are finally slain. The strongest wolves, the one that in life led the packs, are called doom wolves. They are specially raised by vampires to lead their own packs in an unending service of carnage and darkness. The Black Coach. Once a particularly powerful vampire is slain, it is not certain that the world will be rid of this predator of the night. Many of the greatest lords of undeath have returned after their bodies have been destroyed, for who can say which is the master, death or the vampire? If the servants of a particularly powerful vampire can gather his ashes, for once a vampire's life is taken, its body will feel the weight of time and crumble to dust. They will construct a coffin to keep them safe. Then, by performing unholy rituals, they will create a carriage to carry the remains of their lord and take it to places of slaughter. Battlefields and plague-ridden cities in particular strengthen the regenerating spirit of the vampire. This ghostly apparition is driven by an insubstantial wraith and pulled by two grisly nightmares. The legends say that even if the creatures are destroyed, the coach can continue to move on its own, pushed by supernatural powers. The Black Coach is an awe-inspiring, unholy thing from the realm of undeath, which feeds on the souls of mortals. Its mere presence can drain the lifeblood of men, and the more it slays, the more terrifying its power becomes. Few symbols of death are as horrifying for mortals, or as potent an aid to the undead. It is said that the blood of 10,000 mortals can stir the vampire lord from his slumber, ready to walk the land of the living once more. Nightmares. The greatest of the immortal vampires and their servants ride into battle on undead steeds called nightmares. These are the carcasses of great war horses, brought back to life by necromantic arts. Balefire glows in their eyes, and their decomposed bodies are rotted and foul. The sickening stench of death hangs around them as they gallop into battle, crushing the living beneath their moldy hooves. Winged Nightmares. Creating a winged nightmare is the pinnacle of achievement for a master of the necromantic arts. It is a massive creature, assembled from the corpses of powerful monsters, such as manticores, griffins, and hippogriffs. The necromancer has to cast many terrible spells to meld and fuse the remains of these monsters into this nightmarish horror. A winged nightmare is at least as dangerous as the creatures it has been created from, for a talented necromancer can mold flesh and bone as if they were clay to make the creature even more deadly, festooning it with tusks, fangs, spines, and huge malformed claws. When the spell of awakening is complete, the winged nightmare rises and is ready to impale any who stand against its master, with its deadly spines, tusks, and huge razor-sharp claws. Zombie Dragon. Far to the south lies the forbidding Plain of Bones. It is a lifeless desert filled with titanic skeletons from an earlier age. For here, the dragons of old came to rest when their long lives were coming to an end. This continued until the time of Nagash the Black, when the great necromancer performed his unholy ritual of awakening. Dark powers entered the monstrous corpses. The frames of the dead dragons stirred once more, and their empty skulls filled with glowing ghost lights as their rotting carcasses began to prowl the plain of bones. Insane and insatiably hungry for the souls of all living things. When Nagash was defeated, the dragons returned to their eternal slumber. Only the greatest of the princes of undead are able to awaken one of these huge and terrifying creatures. But those who succeed will command a creature that has the power to break the back of any army. Vlad von Carstein, Count of Sylvania. Vlad von Carstein was the first and greatest of the vampire counts of Sylvania. It was he who tainted the once human aristocracy of Sylvania with the curse of undeath, and, in so doing, created an undead kingdom at the heart of the empire. For years he gathered his strength until his forces were strong enough to attempt the conquest of the entire empire. Then, Vlad fought a brilliant campaign against the warring Elector Counts, and almost managed to achieve total victory. He was halted at the very gates of Altdorf, the capital of the empire. Vlad was a towering figure of a man, with a mane of black hair and piercing eyes. Those who met him and survived the encounter described him as having a feral charm, and being extremely intelligent, but with an evil temper that could easily turn into berserker fury if he was thwarted in his endeavors. It was said that at such times only his wife Isabella could calm him without blood being spilt. Isabella was Vlad's most valued confidant and the only person whose advice he trusted. When Vlad was killed by Grand Theogenist Wilhelm at the siege of Altdorf, Isabella committed suicide rather than carry on through eternity without him. Wallach, Blood Knight Grand Master. The mighty vampire lord has brought the curse of undeath to one of the greatest knightly orders of the empire, and built a kingdom of terror where his will is enforced by immortal warriors. Wallach is a proud warrior. His word is a bond stronger than steel, and though he looks upon humans as cattle, If a man of exceptional prowess and courage catches his eye, he challenges such a warrior to single combat. Those who impress him, he invites to join the ranks of his vampiric knights. Those who fail to put up a decent fight, Wallach will slay without mercy. Now, it is believed that Wallach is the master of the Blood Keep once more, and the armies of the dead are said to gather under his banners. Every 100 years, the Blood Knights gather at their keep to feast, recount their deeds and battles, and renew their oaths of fealty to Wallach. One day, Wallach will lead them once more to war. Nechrarchs, the Vampire Queen. Legends tell of an ancient vampire queen who resides in the Silver Pinnacle, high in the World's Edge Mountains. She is known as Nechrarchs, which means she who is beautiful in death in the ancient tongue of Nechrarchs, the land of the dead. At the heart of the maze of the Silver Pinnacle are situated her quarters. Her opulent chambers are an echo of the splendor of the royal palace in Lahmia. Forgotten treasures of old, golden masks and rare gemstones glitter in the dark, illuminated only by the dim light of the silver-coated skulls, which serve as her lamps. Here Nechrarchs lies on a divan, drinking the blood of handsome youths from golden cups, and listening as her undead courtiers play harps, pipes, and lutes to amuse her. Vampires of the Lahmian sisterhood are her eyes and ears in the outside world, and using the information from their reports, she plots and weaves a web of intrigue. For the queen dreams of enslaving all the vampires of the known world, and returning to ancient Lahmia at the head of an undead army to reclaim her throne and rebuild the great Temple of Blood. Vorag, the first Ghoul King. Vorag was a gigantic creature whose hatred for the living and for other vampires was matched only by his urge to rebuild the lost kingdom of Strigoi. Legends say that he was once pursued into the woods of southern Sylvania by a hunting party led by Manfred Von Carstein. Vorag defeated the Count in single combat and drank his blood, thereby increasing his already considerable powers. Around him rallied the many tribes of deranged men inhabiting the forbidding place known as Ghoul Wood in southern Sylvania, and soon he ruled over a huge horde of scavengers. This unruly force of ghouls he took south, crossing the mountains at Blackfire Pass and carving a red trail across the border princes. When he reached the Badlands, his army counted many undead minions as well. Orc and goblin tribes were slaughtered in the thousands as Vorag made his way towards the ruins of ancient Moor Cain. But many more greenskins descended from the World's Edge Mountains to attack the undead. Vorag's fate is unknown, but according to the legends of the Strigoi, he reached his destination and now rules over the ruins of the ancient capital of Strigoi. Heinrich Kemmler, the Lich Master. Heinrich Kemmler was once a great and much feared necromancer, until ambitious rivals began to usurp his power. They nearly succeeded in driving the Lich Master to his death, and, although he finally managed to beat off his attackers, his body was broken and his mind blasted in the battle. For many years, Heinrich wandered the Grey Mountains and the border princes as little more than a half-sane beggar, until by some quirk of fate, he stumbled on the tomb of Krell, a long-dead chaos warrior. Here he struck a terrible pact with the gods of chaos. They restored him to his former power, and in return, Heinrich swore to slay and destroy in their name. Now, once again, the name of the Lich Master strikes terror into the hearts of ordinary folk, and tales of his foul deeds are whispered when retold throughout the old world. Manfred von Carstein. The last and most dangerous of the von Carstein vampire counts is Manfred, a subtle, devious, and treacherous individual. Some say he was awake when the von Carstein ring was stolen, and laid a glamour upon the centuries to prevent them from noticing it. While Conrad von Carstein ravaged the empire in an attempt to emulate the victories of the great Vlad, Manfred laid low and studied the art of necromancy. It is said that he journeyed as far as the kingdom of the dead in search of the secrets of unlife, returning to Castle Drakenhof with a fund of dark lore, and biding his time there until he felt sure of his power. After Conrad's death, he became the undisputed ruler of the Sylvanian hosts, but for a full decade, he did nothing, letting the various contenders for the imperial throne think that the Sylvanian threat was over, giving them time to fall out among themselves, which they duly did. Once the empire was again racked by vicious civil war, Manfred deemed it time to strike. His undead legions crossed the Sylvanian border in the depths of winter, and marched through the snows to Altdorf, putting any villagers they met to the sword, and adding them to the ranks of their army. In the infamous Winter War of 2032, he defeated several hastily assembled imperial armies, which attempted to block his path. Victory followed victory, and mere rumors of Manfred's approach were enough to send villagers fleeing from their homes to freeze to death in the snow. His force reached Altdorf in late winter, and he arrived to find the city battlements empty of defenders. Triumph filled Manfred. He looked set to take the empire's greatest city when the Grand Theogonist Kurt III appeared on the battlements and began to recite the great spell of unbinding from the Liber Mortis. Seeing his followers begin to crumble to dust, Manfred ordered a hasty retreat. Although he was probably the most powerful of the vampire counts, his foes now seemed prepared to meet the undead threat head on. Manfred marched his battered army down the Reich to Marienburg. He intended to lay siege to the port, but found his plan thwarted by the army of Marienburg and a company of high elves who had recently established a trading colony there. Among the elves was the high mage Fenrir, whose awesome power turned the battle against Manfred's force at the crucial moment. Manfred settled down for a lengthy siege until his scouts revealed that an army from Altdorf was fast coming up behind him. He was forced to lift the siege and flee back the length of the empire. So began a long game of cat and mouse, where neither side was entirely sure who was the cat. Manfred's army would be whittled away by armies of the various imperial states, and then would replenish itself after a great victory. Eventually, Manfred was driven back into the Sylvanian forests. Determined not to make the same mistake as they had before, the desperate nobles of the empire swore a truce among themselves, and slowly but surely began to scour the Sylvanian woods. In this task, they were aided by the dwarves. Now united, the citizens of the empire were relentless. Eventually, Manfred was brought to battle at Hel Fen and cut down by the Count of Sturland as he attempted to flee. His body was lost at the very edge of the great swamp, and was never found. For his feat, Martin, Count of Stirland, claimed all of Sylvania and added it to his domains, since no one else actually wanted to claim the accursed land. No one gainsaid him. Thus was ended the threat of the vampire counts. Or so it seemed. Manfred was by far the longest lived of the vampire counts, and rumor has it that he still exists to this present day, threatening to return once more at the head of the undead Sylvanian armies. Indeed, the poet Felix Jaeger claims to have encountered him while in the company of the dwarf Gottric Gernischen, as late as 2503. Jaeger, however, is a known criminal and a populist agitator, and the accounts of his travels are highly fanciful, so serious scholars discount the claim. One doubts whether a mighty vampire such as Manfred von Carstein could really be put to flight by an outcast dwarf, as Jaeger claims. Jaeger's account is no doubt spurious, so we shall content ourselves with the known facts of Manfred's life. As far as this history is concerned, Manfred von Carstein, last of the vampire counts, perished at Hel Fen. Long may he rest. Little is known of the life of Zacharias before he succumbed to the lure of the necromantic arts. He studied under the tutelage of Dieter Helsnicht, and it is probably due to this great necromancer's influence that Zacharias was able to discover the location of the hidden tower of the Nechrarch Lord, Melchior. His intentions were to sneak into the tower's crypt and steal away the Book of Nagash, which Melchior had acquired during his many years of unholy afterlife. As he crept into the tower grounds, Zacharias was caught by the minions of Melchior. That night, rather than killing the over-inquisitive necromancer, Melchior gave him the kiss of the vampire and decided to take him on as a pupil. At first, Zacharias was horrified by his new vampiric form and swore revenge on the Nechrarch Lord. Over the following years, though, he began to embrace the power which Melchior had bestowed upon him. Each night, the two would rise, and Melchior would warn Zacharias that he grew bored of his company, and that he would probably kill him before dawn. But Zacharias was a keen pupil, and would constantly surprise Melchior with his capacity to learn. Melchior taught his acolyte everything he knew, but never let Zacharias near his precious Book of Nagash. Melchior would often fall into fits of insanity, killing his living servants and drinking their blood in a great feast of flesh. Zacharias was wise and always avoided his master's wrath. It was during one of these occasions that Zacharias boldly crept into Melchior's chamber. There, on a great plinth, was the unholy tome. Unfortunately for Zacharias, Melchior returned to his chamber whilst his pupil was still reading, and a great fight ensued. Invigorated by the blood of his dread slaves, Melchior was too powerful for Zacharias, who barely escaped with his life. Deeply wounded, he fled into the Middle Mountains. For the following year, Zacharias was pursued by the minions of Melchior. From one cage refuge to the next, he would flee, tired and severely emaciated from lack of blood, and he would no sooner find a suitably secluded hiding place than his location would be discovered. Finally, he stumbled into a large, dark cavern where he found a small niche deep inside, and there he fell into a second slumber, totally exhausted from the fight with Melchior, and the constant pursuit of Melchior's dark servants. Zacharias's rest was to last for over a decade. During this time, a black dragon also discovered the cave. Unaware of the undead abomination which slept within, she made her nest there, and as do all dragons, gathered a small mound of treasure around her. When Zacharias awoke, his thirst was great, and the sleeping dragon was a perfect source of nourishment. Finding soft, exposed flesh on the dragon's underside, he bit deep into the slumbering monster. The blood of the great beast flowed through the veins of Zacharias, empowering him with untold strength. Such is the might of a vampire, that even a dragon is unable to wake from its deathly bite. Over the following month, Zacharias drank from the great beast, draining it clean of blood. Legends say that drinking the blood of a dragon frees vampires from their need for blood for the rest of their eternal life. If that is true, then who knows what other powers were bestowed upon Zacharias by the blood of the great worm. Using the dark necromantic powers he had learnt from Melchior, he raised the dragon from death and flew on its back to Melchior's hidden keep, where he fought a great battle with his master. It is said that so powerful were the magic forces unleashed that the tower was all but destroyed. When the dust and debris cleared, Zacharias was the victor. Of Melchior no one knows of his fate. Some say he was slain by Zacharias, who drank his blood to gain further powers. Others believe that Melchior is in hiding, licking his wounds whilst plotting revenge on his former pupil. Whatever Melchior's fate, Zacharias claimed all of the magical wealth that his master had acquired and hoarded over his long rule of terror, including the powerful Book of Nagash. Zacharias now rules over the Forest of Shadows, where both the orcs of the mountains and the people of the forest live in equal fear of the vengeance of Zacharias, the Everliving. An excerpt from a sacred book of vampire hunting. Chapter 10, being a description of the diverse artifacts with which the righteous shall equip themselves against the undead. The book. Keepest thou the sacred book with thee always, so none that are unclean may come nigh unto it, and its pages shall be of vellum, inscribed in the high tongue, and the leather bindings shall be graven with all the marks of Sigmar. When thou recitest from the book, speakest thou with authority, that the evildoer may tremble at thy words, and shrink back from thee, for they cannot show their faces to righteousness. The stake and the hammer. Seek the holy tree of Sigmar, and from its staves cut these sturdy stakes. Harden the spikes in the holy flame, while reciting the words of banishment. Take thou thine hammer, like unto that which holy Sigmar wielded on his day of valor. Let it be graven with his holy sigil, against which nothing that is unclean may prevail. And know ye that the unclean shall be dispatched with but 3 strikes of the hammer upon the stake, and the stake will penetrateth the heart of the evil, and accomplish the banishment for all eternity. And when thou striketh, say the prayer of Sigmar. The mirror. Take thou a mirror of polished silver, which cometh out of the dwarf realms and tarnisheth not. Behold its incorruptible metal, and revealeth the souls of men. Keep it discreetly, and let not anyone see it in the palm of thine hand. Whosoever shall have no reflection in the mirror, ye shall deliver unto them the holy stake of banishment, the sacred water. And thou shalt have with thee a vial, and the sacred water of the well of Sigmar shall be within it. Draw thou this from the holy temple upon his feast day. Behold, the sacred water burneth the flesh of the undead, and causeth them to recoil from thee. The sign of Sigmar. And this shall be the mark of the witch hunter. He shall wear the sign of Sigmar, which is the twin-tailed comet. By this sign, his foes may know that the power of holy Sigmar is within him, and shall withstand the wrath of holy Sigmar, who cometh to save from the depredations of evil. Whosoever maketh the sign with his hands, he shall be protected.